Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our working now through the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now in Song of Myself, passage 17. Now this really is a pivotal kind of moment in Song of Myself. In some ways we can see this as kind of a turning point. We will have now passage 17, 18, and 19 as in some ways what some have argued as the Whitman's integral or inclusive song. And we're going to see a real shift from all of that cataloging that will have transpired in earlier sections. Now all of a sudden you're going to get a sense that the poem shifts in some ways. The other thing I want to point out is that there's some heavy editing that happened from the 1855 edition for this poem of 17 to the final deathbed edition, and we're going to look at that here in a moment. Now, my assumption is you've been working with us at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist. My hope is that you are with us for the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of starting from Poetic, and you've been with us all the way through up through passage 16 of Song of Myself. Now, I've already given a lecture that we've posted at learnstrong.net and at YouTube over passage 17. It's there in the description section of this very lecture, and I'm going to challenge you to go watch that lecture first, because there's a lot that I say there. I obviously don't want to be too redundant. Now I'm going to say some of the same things that I said, but I'm now working from a little different perspective. My hope is that you've already been exposed to that information. Now let's go ahead and turn to a reading of this passage. It is short enough to allow us to do that. I want to read it first of all as the deathbed edition, and then obviously as we exegete we'll mess around with the others, okay? Passage 17. These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they're nothing, or next to nothing. If they're not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they're nothing. If they're not just as close as they are distant, they're nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This, the common air that bathes the globe. Now, actually, that's not how the poem ends. There's an additional 5 lines, and I think what I'll do now is just, because it's a short poem, I'm going to go ahead and now read the 1855 edition. I'm not going to say a whole lot about the lost lines, as they're sometimes referred to, but I am going to point them out as we work through them. And I'm going to challenge you to consider Whitman as poet and ask, why do you think he edited some of these lines out? Let's read it again. Passage 17. These are the thoughts of men in all ages and lands. They're not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they're nothing or next to nothing. And then an edited line. If they do not enclose everything, they are next to nothing. If they're not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they're nothing. If they're not just as close as they're distant, they're nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe. And now, the lines that were edited out of the deathbed edition. This is the breath of laws and songs and behavior. This, the tasteless water of souls. This is the true sustenance. It is for the illiterate. It's for the judges of the Supreme Court. It's for the federal capital and the state capitals. It's for the admirable communes of literary men and composers and singers and lecturers and engineers and savants. It's for the endless races of working people and farmers and seamen. Now that's fascinating that would be how this passage ends, and of course it does beg the question, why is it that those lines were edited out? Now there will be echoes of them as they will return, and obviously those lines have already been gestured at from our study of inscriptions and starting from Poetic, and now of course even in our preceding 16 sections of Song of Myself. When we begin passage 17, these is the word that starts it. And here again, Learning from Shakespeare, he loves his vague antecedents. These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. What are really the thoughts of all men? What's he talking about? And of course we understand that what he's talking about are the very poems that he is compiling into what he will call his book. In the inscriptions, poems, of course, Leaves of Grass itself. In other words, he's making somewhat a defense, possibly to the acrimonious audience, as we talked about in earlier lectures, to the skeptic, who is wondering, what is the point of all this silliness anyway? And of course, we have to answer a question like this as it relates to even our talks with Walt. Really? As an interviewer asked me recently, you're giving lectures over every single line of Leaves of Grass? Why? To which, of course, I think there are a number of answers. I think one of the answers is right here in passage 17. This is what Whitman says about the very text that he's playing with. And notice the use of the word really. These are really, and by the way, this word was not in, if you caught that, in the original 1855 edition. These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They're not original with me. Now, this is where we get our line. The new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. That is to say, Whitman wants to argue, I'm tapping into a very, very ancient perennial philosophy that goes way, way back in time. And because of that, I can't be really considered an originator of thinking. Now, of course, the ironies abound because Whitman himself thought of himself as very original. We today obviously think of him as very original. And of course, the fact that he says, these are the thoughts that everyone has thought, well, that seems a little bit egotistical to say the least, right? In other words, he is taking on the bardic voice, as we have said in earlier lectures. To that degree, the modern Homer. I think Whitman was acutely aware that what he was doing in Song of Myself was writing a new epic, an American epic. I think it was answering directly the call from Emerson, as we've said in earlier lectures. And I think here he's beginning to defend himself to some degree and say, this is my true mission. Notice, he then will have 3 lines, the anaphorias, we have said, the repeated first line. He'll have 3 lines that will begin with the word if, and it's an interesting construction. If they, that is to say these poems of Leaves of Grass, if they're not yours as much as mine, they're nothing. Now, of course, he's going to use the famous nothing word of Lear, King Lear, Shakespeare's play, nothing comes of nothing. In other words, he says, my poems are only of value if they become yours. Now, let's put it in our notes. We saw this already in the inscriptions. We saw it in Pomenoc. We definitely saw it in the opening 16 sections of Song of Myself. Whitman loves this level of intimacy. It's as if he's reaching out directly to you and saying directly to you, if you don't get it, then all this is worth nothing. All of my time, all my energy to construct this set of poems is a waste of both your time and my time, right? He says, if they're not yours as much as mine, they're nothing or next to nothing. Notice the fallibilist principle, right? If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. Now, in my preceding lecture, I spent quite a bit of time with this idea of the riddle. Earlier, we were talking about, of course, his discussion from passage 4 about the game, in and out of the game, right? Both looking at it and wondering at it. And the sense that Whitman is very interested in the riddle, the real questions. As we've said in our lectures on Shakespeare at LearnStrong.net, the thing that makes Shakespeare so amazing is that he asks and sometimes answers the great questions of humanity. And I think we could certainly say this for Whitman as well. He learned much of that idea, obviously, from Shakespeare. And notice he says, there's a certain question that stands behind all of existence and humanity. What is that question? Well, there are really 5, aren't they? And there are a big 5. What can we know? Epistemology. Who are we? Ontology. How do our minds work and where do thoughts come from? Psychology. When you put a bunch of people together, why do they behave the way they do? Sociology. And maybe most significantly of our 5, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? It seems kind of silly and useless to even be alive with all this pain. The question of theodicy. And he says, combining all that, let's call it a riddle. And he says, I'm going to do something quite enigmatic. He says, I'm going to provide the riddle and the untying of the riddle. In other words, I'm going to state the questions, I'm going to try to provide answers. And if I can't do that, then again he uses the word nothing. What I'm attempting here, it's a waste of time. Notice the third if. If they're not just as close as they are distant, they are nothing. By the way, this is the fourth use of the word nothing as well. This repetition obviously is powerful at level 2b. In other words, I'm going to take ideas that come very, very close to you, but at the same time, they're going to be penultimate ideas that are incredibly distant. In other words, I'm going to mess around with what Mortimer Adler will call, of course, the great ideas, the challenging, the most dynamic of all ideas. And in that process, I'm going to do this through these poems that I'm providing with you. And then he changes from these as his first word now to this. And of course, you can ask, what's the antecedent of the pronoun this that will, by the way, end both of these last two lines of 17? Well, the book is probably the best way to say that, but notice he'll take us right to the title again, Leaves of Grass. This is the grass. That is to say, these poems that grows, again, the evolutionary model, as we've talked about so many times, wherever the land is and the water is. Now, these are going to be completely finished for us and brought to fruition for us in passage 46, 47, the beginning of 47, which is really, some argue, the real heart and soul of Whitman's pedagogy. Those symbols of land and water will be significant. And of course, when we get to T.S. Eliot in our study of four quartets, we'll play around, obviously, with land and water as we play around with those four quartets. The water, obviously, being the dry salve ages, no doubt about that, right? Notice the irony that grass doesn't grow on water until you go back to earlier passages like 5, and you realize there is grass. Moss is grass. And when you go to the beach or you go to the lake, you see this grass stuff that grows underneath. This seaweed, we might say, right? This weed, this grass. In other words, when Whitman uses the term grass, he obviously is referencing not only what's on land, but also what's on sea. And of course, yes, no question, in 3a, he's taking us back to the Genesis account of the creation as well. And then he finishes by saying, this is the common air. So you'll see it, right? We're going air and water and land, the elements, right? That bathes the globe. Now, the word globe is significant for the last. This is how he decided to edit. All those other lines edited out. I'm going to leave to you as to exactly why, and to the scholars that study Whitman much closer than we are here. But it is fascinating that he ends passage 17 with the word globe. And I think when we look at passage 17, 18, and 19 as a group, as I've suggested we should, the word globe is central. Whereas before he's been looking very, very specifically at individuals in all these lists and being very specific. Now he becomes far more universalist. So here we are with Whitman, the great integral thinker, the great unifier, the great universalist thinker, and he's using this word globe. In other words, I want my poetry to be as common as the air that we breathe. Now, of course, we've played this game philosophically in 303 before. Of all the things a fish can know, the one thing a fish can never know is water, because, of course, a fish just lives in the water and therefore can't understand water at all. If that's true for fish, then what we say about air, of all the things a human can know, the one thing a human can never truly know is air. Some have, of course, argued that there's a few other things that we live so much in, like, for example, energy, that there's no way we can really know energy. Notice he's going to play the game of what is the riddle that will confuse, baffle the whole globe. I'm going to provide that information. Now, let's just say it out loud. This is far more even radical than Milton's opening lines from Paradise Lost, to attempt things yet, to try to write a poem of things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Now, how do we finish our reading here at 2a with themes, messages? Well, obviously, everything is connected, and Leaves of Grass is going to be Whitman's integral, universal song. It's for the whole globe, right? At 2b, I'll leave it to you about the edited lines and why they're out and what your thoughts are about those. And as well, this vague antecedent. He loves to do this. I want to point this out because we're going to see this again. Obviously, there's some anaphoria going on here as well. At 3a, well, the American philosopher Ken Wilber, in his any number of books, but Marriage of Sense and Soul is one that we will often recommend in 303. If you're interested in the integral psychology and philosophy of Ken Wilber, obviously plays right into this kind of thing. Passage to India will be the poem where Whitman will play around with this notion of the globe so profoundly, and the power of the poet-artist to bring that information, the riddle, to the masses. The fact that he uses the word riddle will take us back to our study of Pope's Essay on Man. Go back and look at what we've said there. Notice he finishes that little section that we love to study as being the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. I think it's very possible that Whitman could have been playing around with a game like that as well. And finally, at 3b, I asked this question in my other lecture, which I hope you've already watched, where I spend quite a bit of time at 3b. What are the real questions, the ones that you really need to have answered? I think I asked it in my other lecture as I was considering lecturing to a group of juniors. If I could answer any one question that you could ask, what would that one question be, and why would you choose that one question? Let's just imagine for a moment that McGee has the ability to answer any single question you could generate, but you only get one. What would that question be and why? It's in many ways, of course, you get 3 wishes and not allowed to get a wish for more wishes, but you only get one question. What would that question be and why? Of course, sometimes we'll ask it about our big 5. Of those big 5, which for you are the most intriguing of the 5 as a question? What can you know? Who are you? The ontological question. The psychological question about fears, motivations. The sociological question about why it is groups behave the way they behave. Or for you, is it the theodicy question? That is to say, why is there pain and suffering in the world, right? I hope that our study of Leaves of Grass will begin to help you understand the riddle and the possible untying of the riddle as well. Thank you.